Biodiversity is important for the maintenance and protection of Australia's flora and fauna. It is both essential for our existence and intrinsically valuable in its own right. Australia is a mega-diverse country, meaning that despite covering less than 10% of the global surface, it holds more than 70% of the world's biodiversity. Diversity can be defined as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part.
A commitment to biodiversity is being enshrined in international and national policy. Australia's natural resource plans and legislation such as the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, EPBCA, National Parks and Wildlife Act, and Native Vegetation Conservation Act all play a role in managing biodiversity. The EPBCA was developed to provide for the protection of the environment. It provides a truly national scheme of environmental and heritage protection and biodiversity conservation. Legislation has generally been the most effective way of managing environmental values, as Stephanie McLuckie reports.
The most important step to conserving biodiversity is preventing incompatible land use in species-rich areas worthy of preservation. This is most effectively done through planning and development law. However, the ESG framework has not yet ensured adequate biodiversity protection. Once reasonable avoidance measures have been undertaken, governments should then focus efforts on mitigation. This is where market-based approaches have been used to supplement the standard approach. Biobanking in New South Wales is a voluntary scheme that is being introduced to address biodiversity issues, whereby landowners and developers generate credits that are sold to provide income or to offset other projects. However, there are difficulties in regards to transparency, measurement and consistency, with the likelihood that offsets will not compensate for the overall biodiversity loss of a development. As such, this scheme is an unacceptable trade-off between certain loss and uncertain gain. Under the common law, only personal interests are actionable and there is no direct duty of care owed to the environment. Whilst the extent of an indirect duty is evolving in Australian courts, there is considerable uncertainty regarding its application. Further judgments of the highest judicial authority may clarify the issue. However, this would be a relatively slow and expensive process. Whilst communities whose actions determine the survival of biodiversity should be compensated for the opportunity cost of conservation, neither the common law or market-based approach is effective. We recommend prioritising conservation and community engagement in planning decisions, with clearer and consistent legislative provisions through all levels of government.
Long-term environmental pressures will continue to be the main cause of biodiversity loss, but other pressures such as climate change will magnify these impacts. Australia's Biodiversity Conservation Strategy of 2010 to 2030 outlines Australia's goals for biodiversity and creates collective priorities for its conservation. A review of the first 5 years of the strategy was conducted in 2016 by Mr. Alan Holmes, Professor Jane Doolan and Dr. Mark Stafford-Smith. We spoke to Professor Doolan last week.
While I can see some progress in regards to the overall objectives of this strategy, it is evident that it has not been a strong driver of these efforts. As you can see, we believe there are multiple weaknesses in regard to the strategy's effectiveness. We believe that the most important issue raised within our review is that the relationship between people and biodiversity is not adequately highlighted. Today, I'd like to emphasise this issue and describe the way in which the strategy fails to engage, guide and communicate its objectives to all audiences in a useful way. For this strategy to be effective, all Australians must have an understanding and thus communication is a crucial element for the Commonwealth. As I can see here, there are many technical words that even I struggle to make sense of at times. I cannot see how a broad audience would be expected to understand such jargon as well as the heavy text. Additionally, I can see that this strategy has failed to effectively guide the efforts of governments, other organisations or individuals and does not clearly articulate its intended use for different levels of government.
That was Jane Doolan on Australia's Biodiversity Conservation Strategy. Ashley McIntyre will now explore the government's role in biodiversity conservation and what actions the government have taken to secure Australia's biodiversity future.
Thank you, Alex. Current legislative instruments, while effective in some respects, are failing to operate to a full potential. This is vastly due to an inability to communicate key policy objectives to a broader audience, alongside the lack of clarity regarding key environmental protection targets within government sectors. Responsibility for biodiversity is divided among many authorities, creating a complex regulatory web, often discretionary in its application. Clarity is urgently required regarding which environmental planning instruments apply to each development. this information must also be easily accessible to the broader public. Moreover, amendments to the Act have severely impacted upon community involvement. In order for the government to combat community disengagement with the planning process, there needs to be legislative mandatory consultation requirements that guarantee genuine community involvement and approval. As has been noted, both market strategies such as biodiversity offsets and common law actions alone are ineffective at securing Australia's biodiversity future. While Australia is working towards an integrated biodiversity strategy, the challenge is to communicate the value and importance of ecosystem services to new and existing supporters in much more compelling ways. There are opportunities to enhance communication, to make the concept more accessible to a wider audience, and motivate behavioural change through the implementation of community-orientated projects. These could potentially include mandatory community forums where all potential developments must be disclosed. There is also a need to identify priority groups with an interest in law reform that could have a role in development planning, with the capacity to facilitate feedback to the relevant departments or MPs. Other communication-based strategies which may be considered include the utilisation of social networking platforms and dialogue circles to engage more immediately with the community. The inclusion of biodiversity education strategies at a primary and secondary level would also establish an informed foundation, paving the way for future environmental activism. While there are endless campaigns which could be developed, the success rate is ultimately dependent on the ability of a broad audience to understand the key concepts of biodiversity. Careful explanation of the concept using simple, relevant and coherent language, as well as emphasising how humans rely and depend on nature, would help engender a broader public engagement with the national strategy.
For more information, please read the 5-year review. We will post a link at the end.